You know, when I first decided to learn web development, I was completely overwhelmed. I mean, where do you even start? There are thousands of tutorials online, coding boot camps charging ridiculous amount of money, and everyone seems to have a different opinion about the right way to learn HTML and CSS. I tried watching YouTube videos, following online courses, and honestly, I felt like I was just copying and pasting code without really understanding what I was doing. That's when someone recommended Jon Duckett's HTML and CSS, design and build websites to me. Now, I'll be honest, my first thought was, really? A physical book? In 2026? I mean, we're living in the age of ChatGPT and AI coding assistants, and someone's telling me to read a book that was published back in 2011. But here's the thing, this person whose opinion I trusted swore by it, saying it was a book that finally made web development click for them. So I grabbed a copy, and I have to tell you, within the first few pages, I understood why this book has remained so popular for over a decade. Jon Duckett isn't just teaching you HTML and CSS. He's teaching you how to think about web development. And the way this book is designed, it's absolutely beautiful. We're talking full color, gorgeous layout, plenty of white space, clear examples. It doesn't look like a typical programming book at all. Let me give you some context about the author. Jon Duckett has been working in web design and development for years, and he's worked with major brands like Greenpeace, Nike, and Disney. But what makes him special isn't just his client list. It's his ability to take complex technical concepts and make them accessible to complete beginners. And that's exactly what he does in this 490-page book. Now, before we dive deep into what I learned from this book, I want to be completely transparent with you. This book was published in 2011, which in internet years is like ancient history. So as we go through this review, I'm going to be pointing out what's still relevant today, what's become outdated, and how you can adapt the lessons from this book to modern web development. Because here's the thing, the fundamentals that Duckett teaches haven't changed. HTML is still HTML. CSS is still CSS. What has changed is the tools we use, some best practices, and of course, we now have newer versions like HTML5 and CSS3 that have become standard. I spent about 2 weeks working through this entire book, actually typing out the examples, experimenting with the code, and building little projects along the way. And I'm going to share everything I learned, the good, the bad, and what you need to know if you're considering picking up this book in 2026. All right, so let's start at the beginning, because Duckett does something really smart here that most coding tutorials completely skip over. Instead of just throwing you into syntax and tags, he takes the time to explain how the web actually works. And I know that might sound basic, but trust me, understanding this foundation made everything else make so much more sense. He starts by talking about how we're used to seeing structured documents in our everyday lives, newspapers, insurance forms, catalogs. These documents all have structure, right? Headlines, body text, images, captions. And what Duckett explains is that HTML is essentially about creating that same kind of structure for web pages. It's about organizing information so that browsers know what a heading, what a paragraph, what's a list. One concept that really stuck with me was when he explained how browsers and web servers communicate. You type a URL into your browser, and here's what happens. Your computer contacts a domain name system server, basically like a phone book for the internet, that converts that readable URL into an IP address. Then your browser connects to that web server and requests the page. The server sends back HTML and CSS. Your browser interprets it, and boom, you see a web page. Now, why is this important to understand? Because when you're building websites, you need to think about what you're actually creating. You're creating files, HTML files, CSS files, image files, that will live on a server somewhere. And when someone visits your website, their browser is downloading those files and interpreting your code to display the page. Understanding this flow helped me think more critically about things like file organization, loading times, and how to structure my projects. Duckett then introduces a fundamental concept that HTML uses tags, these little bits of code wrapped in angle brackets, to tell a browser what each piece of content is. And he uses this brilliant analogy of tags acting like containers. The opening tag says, hey, this is the start of a paragraph, and the closing tag says, okay, the paragraph is done. What's between those tags is the content that gets displayed. What I found really helpful was how he breaks down the anatomy of an HTML element. You got your opening tag, your closing tag, and your content. But then you also have attributes, which give additional information about the element. Like an image tag needs to know where the image file is located. So you use the src attribute to specify the path. Or a link needs to know where it's linking to. So you use the ref attribute. This might sound really basic, and maybe you're thinking, yeah, I know what HTML tags are, but the way Duckett explains it makes it click. He shows you the code, then shows you what it looks like in the browser, then explains why it works that way. And he does this throughout the entire book. The book then moves into actually writing HTML, and this is where Duckett's teaching approach really shines. He starts with the absolute basics, the HTML head and body elements. These are the fundamental building blocks of every web page. The HTML element wraps everything and says, "Hey browser, this is HTML code." The head element contains information about the page, things like the title you see in the browser tab, links to CSS files, meta information, and the body element contains everything that actually appears on the page. One thing that struck me as I was reading through this section was how methodical Duckett is about explaining why things work the way they do. He doesn't just say, "This is how you write a heading." He explains that there are 6 levels of headings in HTML, from H1 to H6, and why you might use different levels. The H1 is your main heading. H2 is for subheadings. H3 for sub-subheadings, and so on. This creates a hierarchy of information, which is important not just for visual presentation, but also for accessibility and SEO. Speaking of which, and this is something I really appreciated, Duckett consistently emphasizes the importance of semantic HTML. What does that mean? It means using HTML elements that describe the content they contain. Don't just use div elements for everything. Use article elements for articles, nav elements for navigation, aside elements for sidebar content. This makes your code more meaningful and helps screen readers interpret your page for visually impaired users. The section on text formatting was particularly comprehensive. He covers paragraphs, bold, and italic text, and the difference between the visual formatting tags like B and I versus the semantic tags like strong and M, line breaks, horizontal rules, quotations, citations, definitions, abbreviations, basically everything you need to properly mark up text content. And what I loved was that he explains not just how to use these elements, but when to use them and why they matter. For example, when talking about the strong element versus the B element, both make text bold, right? But strong has semantic meaning. It indicates that something is strongly emphasized, whereas B is just for making text bold without implying importance. Modern screen readers and search engines pay attention to these distinctions. It's not just about making things look right. It's about making your code meaningful. The chapter on lists might seem simple on the surface, but Duckett does something clever here. He shows you 3 types of lists: ordered lists numbered, unordered lists bulleted, and definition lists, terms and definitions. But more importantly, he shows you how to nest lists within lists, creating complex hierarchical structures. This is huge when you're building navigation menus, organizing content, or creating multi-level lists. What really helped me understand lists was when he explained that browsers automatically indent lists and add bullet points or numbers. You don't have to do that manually. The browser knows what to do when it sees a O or OL element. But here's where CSS comes in later. You can completely customize how lists look, change the bullet style, remove bullets entirely, make list items display horizontally instead of vertically. Understanding the default behavior first made it so much easier to customize lists later. Then we get to one of the most fundamental aspects of the web, links. And Duckett spent a lot of time on this, because links are what make the web, well, the web. He explains absolute URLs versus relative URLs. And this is where a lot of beginners get tripped up. An absolute URL is a complete address, like https://www.example.com/page.html. A relative URL is a shorthand that's relative to your current page, like /page.html. Understanding relative URLs was a game changer for me. When you're building a website, you want to use relative URLs for links between your own pages, because if you ever move your site to a different domain, you don't have to update all those links. Duckett walks you through directory structure, parent and child folders, and how to construct relative URLs that work. He even covers linking to specific parts of a page using ID attributes and fragment identifiers. Now, here's where the book gets really practical. The chapter on images. And let me tell you, there is so much more to images on the web than just slapping an IMG tag on your page. Duckett covers choosing the right image format, JPEG for photographs, GIF or PNG for graphics with flat colors, optimizing images for web use, controlling image dimensions, aligning images, and the critical importance of alt text. The alt text discussion was particularly eye-opening for me. I always thought alt text was just for when images don't load. But Duckett explains that it's crucial for accessibility. Screen readers read the alt text to visually impaired users. It's also important for SEO. Search engines can't see images, so they rely on alt text to understand what an image shows. Writing good alt text is an art in itself. You want to be descriptive but concise, informative but not keyword stuffed. One section that I found incredibly useful was about image preparation. Duckett walks you through the 3 rules for creating images for the web. Save images in the right format, save images at the right size, and use the correct resolution. He explains that computer screens typically display images at 72 pixels per inch, so saving images at higher resolutions just makes the files unnecessarily large and slow to download. He talks about cropping images, resizing them, and using tools like Photoshop or free alternatives like GIMP. What I really appreciated was his discussion of image sprites, combining multiple images into one file and using CSS to display just the part you want. This reduces the number of HTTP requests your page makes, which will significantly speed up loading times. He shows you how to create rollover effects and buttons using this technique. Now, I'll admit, in 2026 we have newer techniques like SVG and icon fonts that are often better solutions, but understanding the sprite concept was still valuable for me. The tables chapter was interesting because Duckett is very clear about when you should and shouldn't use tables. Back in the early days of the web, designers used tables for page layout, which was a terrible practice. Tables should be used for tabular data, things like financial data, schedules, comparisons. He shows you how to create basic tables with rows and columns, how to add table headers, how to make cells span multiple columns or rows, and how to add captions. What struck me here was how much semantic markup matters, even for something as straightforward as a table. Using TH elements for headers instead of just TD elements with bold text makes a huge difference for accessibility. Using Fiat, body, and foot elements to group table content helps screen readers navigate the table and allows for better print styling. Again, it's not just about making it look right. It's about making it meaningful. Duckett also covers some old-school table attributes that have been deprecated in favor of CSS styling, but he explains why they existed and what CSS properties replaced them. This historical context actually helped me understand why CSS works the way it does. It's solving problems that HTML alone couldn't solve cleanly. Now we get to forms. And this is where things get really practical because forms are how users interact with your website. Whether the contact form, a search box, a login page, or an e-commerce checkout, you need to understand forms. And Duckett does an excellent job breaking down what can be a complex topic. He starts with the basics of how forms work. You have a form element that wraps everything. Form controls like text inputs and buttons inside the form. And when the user submits the form, that data gets sent to a server. The server processes the data, using a server-side language like PHP or Python, and sends back a response. Understanding this flow is crucial because as a front-end developer, you need to know what data the server needs and how to properly structure your forms. Duckett covers every type of form control: text inputs, password inputs, text areas, radio buttons, checkboxes, drop-down menus, file upload buttons, submit buttons. For each one, he explains when to use it, how to structure it, and what attributes you need. The name attribute for identifying the data, the value attribute for what gets sent to the server, the checked or selected attributes for default selections. What I found particularly helpful was his discussion of form structure and labeling. Using label elements properly isn't just about accessibility, although that's hugely important. It also improves usability. When you click on a label associated with a checkbox or radio button, it selects that control. That makes your form easier to use, especially on mobile devices where precision clicking is harder. He also covers field set and legend elements for grouping related form controls, which makes complex forms more understandable. And he discusses HTML5 form validation attributes like required and the new input types like email, URL, and date. Now, keep in mind this book was written in 2011, so HTML5 was still new and not fully supported everywhere. In 2026, these features are standard and widely supported, which actually makes forms easier to build than they were when this book was written. There's a chapter on what Duckett calls extra markup, things that don't fit neatly into other categories but are important to know. This includes doc type declarations, which tell the browser what version of HTML you're using, comments in HTML, ID and class attributes, div and span elements for grouping, iframes for embedding content from other sites, and meta elements for providing information about your page. The discussion of doc types was interesting from a historical perspective. Duckett explains the evolution from HTML4 to XHTML to HTML5 and the differences between them. In HTML5, the doc type is super simple, just doc type HTML. But understanding where it came from and why it matters helped me appreciate the importance of standards and backward compatibility. The section on meta elements was particularly valuable. These are elements that go in the head of your document and provide metadata about the page. Things like the description that shows up in search results, keywords for search engines, though these matter much less now than they used to, and information about the character encoding. Duckett explains how search engines use this information and why it's important for SEO. One thing he covers that I hadn't really thought about before was escape characters, special codes for displaying characters that have special meaning in HTML, like the less than and greater than symbols, or copyright and trademark symbols. You can't just type these directly because they might be interpreted as HTML code, so you need to use character entities. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of thing that can cause frustration if you don't know about it. Now, this is where the book shows its age a bit. There's an entire chapter on Flash, how to add Flash movies to your web pages, how to use SWF Object to embed Flash video players. And look, when this book was written in 2011, Flash was still widely used for video, animations, and interactive content. But Flash is dead now. Adobe officially discontinued it in 2020, and modern browsers don't support it at all. However, Duckett also covers HTML5 video and audio elements, which are what we use today. He explains the different video formats, H.264, WBM, OGG, how to provide multiple formats for browser compatibility, how to add controls, how to make video responsive. The principles he teaches here are still relevant, even though the specific implementation details have evolved. What I appreciated was his discussion of hosted video services like YouTube and Vimeo versus self-hosting. He lays out the advantages and disadvantages of each approach. Hosted services handle the encoding and bandwidth, but you lose some control, while self-hosting gives you complete control, but requires more technical knowledge and can be expensive if you have high traffic. The audio section covers similar ground HTML5 audio elements, different audio formats, MP3, OGG, Vorbis, providing fallbacks for older browsers. Again, the specifics have changed as browser support has improved, but the foundational concepts remain relevant. All right, now we get to the CSS section, and this is where web development goes from functional to beautiful. Duckett starts by explaining what CSS is and why it exists. HTML is about structure and content. What is this thing? CSS is about presentation. How should this thing look? Separating structure from presentation is a fundamental principle of modern web development, and Duckett does a great job explaining why this separation matters. He introduces a concept of CSS selectors, properties, and values. A CSS rule targets specific HTML elements using selectors, specifies which aspect of those elements you want to change properties, and sets what those aspects should be values. So you might have a rule that says, for all paragraph selector, make the text color, property, blue value. What really helped me understand CSS was when Duckett explained the cascade and inheritance. CSS stands for cascading style sheets, and that cascade is crucial. When multiple rules could apply to the same element, which one wins. There are rules about specificity. More specific selectors override general ones. Order, later rules override earlier ones. And importance, rules marked as important override normal rules. Understanding these rules saves you from so much confusion and frustration. Inheritance means that some CSS properties pass down from parent elements to child elements. If you set the font for the body element, all the text inside the body inherits that font unless you override it. This is incredibly powerful because it lets you set defaults at a high level and only specify exceptions where needed. Duckett covers 3 ways to add CSS to your pages. Inline styles, directly on HTML elements using the style attribute. Internal style sheets in a style element in the head. And external style sheets in a separate CSS file linked with a link element. He explains the pros and cons of each, but makes it clear that external style sheets are generally the best practice for any real project. The color chapter goes deep into how color works on the web. Duckett explains 3 main ways to specify colors in CSS. Color names like red or dark blue, hex codes like hashtag A380, and RGB values like RGB 238, 62, 128. He explains what each of these means and when you might use each. What I found fascinating was his discussion of color theory and design principles. He talked about contrast and legibility, how you need sufficient contrast between text and background for readability, especially for people with visual impairments. He shows examples of good and bad color combinations and explains why they work or don't work. Duckett also covers opacity and the newer RGBA and HSLA color models that let you specify transparency. This was really useful for creating overlays, light boxes, and subtle design effects. He explains HSL, hue, saturation, lightness, as a more intuitive way to think about color compared to RGB. It's often easier to adjust the lightness of a color while keeping the hue the same than to fiddle with RGB values. One thing that really stuck with me was his emphasis on using a consistent color palette throughout your site. He suggests choosing 3 to 5 colors maximum and sticking to those throughout your design. This creates visual cohesion and makes your site feel more professional. He shows examples of different color schemes, monochromatic, complementary, analogous, and how to apply them effectively. The text chapter is all about typography, and this is where CSS really lets you make your content beautiful. Duckett covers all the basic text properties: font family, font size, font weight, font style, text alignment, text decoration, line height, letter spacing, word spacing. What I loved about this chapter was how he explained the limitations and possibilities of web typography. When this book was written, you were pretty much limited to web-safe fonts that most computers had installed. Times New Roman, Arial, Georgia, Verdana, that was about it. He explains font stacks, where you list multiple fonts in order of preference, with a generic family at the end as a fallback. But he also covers the @font face rule, which lets you load custom fonts from your server. This was revolutionary when it became widely supported because it meant designers could use any typeface they wanted. He discusses services like Google Fonts and Typekit that host fonts and make them easy to use. In 2026, custom web fonts are completely standard, and we have even better tools and techniques. But Duckett's explanation of the fundamentals is still valuable. The section on readability was particularly insightful. He talks about line length, 45 to 75 characters is optimal. Line height, slightly larger than you might think, usually 1.4 to 1.6 times the font size, and choosing appropriate fonts for body text versus headings. These are design principles that don't really change, even as technology evolves. Duckett also covers pseudo-classes like hover, active, and visited for styling links in different states. And he introduces pseudo-elements like first line and first letter for special styling effects. These are powerful tools for adding polish to your designs without cluttering your HTML with extra elements. Now we get to one of the most fundamental concepts in CSS. The box model. This is something that trips up a lot of beginners, but Duckett explains it really well. In CSS, every element is treated as a box. That box has 4 parts. The content area, padding, space between the content and the border and margin, space outside the border to other elements. Understanding the box model is crucial because it affects how you size and space elements on your page. If you set an element's width to 300 pixels, that's just the content width. The padding, border, and margin are added on top of that. So if you have 20 pixels of padding on each side, a 1-pixel border, and 10 pixels of margin, the element actually takes up 364 pixels of horizontal space. Duckett covers how to control each part of the box model: the width and height properties, the padding property, which you can set for all sides at once or individually, the border property with options for thickness, style, and color, and the margin property. He explains shorthand notation, where you can specify all 4 sides in one line of code. One concept that really helped me was his explanation of margin collapsing. When you have 2 vertically adjacent elements, their margins don't add up, they collapse, and only the larger margin is used. This is confusing at first, but understanding it prevents you from wondering why you're not getting the spacing you expected. He also covers minimum and maximum widths and heights, which are super useful for creating responsive designs that work on different screen sizes. And he talked about overflow, what happens when content is too big for its box. You can hide it, show it with scroll bars, or just let it overflow. The section on CSS3 additions to the box model was exciting: rounded corners with border radius, box shadows with box shadow, and border images. These properties let you create sophisticated visual effects that use to require images and complex HTML. In 2026, these are standard tools in every web developer's toolkit. Duckett dedicates a chapter to styling specific types of elements, lists, tables, and forms. For lists, he shows how to change bullet styles, use custom images as bullets, position a marker inside or outside the list, and even remove bullets entirely to create navigation menus. The tables section focuses on making tabular data more readable and attractive. He covers border spacing and collapse, setting different color for alternate rows, zebra striping, adding hover effects, and properly sizing columns. He emphasizes that good table design prioritizes readability. The styling should help users parse the data, not distract from it. Styling forms are particularly important because forms need to be both attractive and usable. Duckett shows how to style text inputs, text areas, buttons, and other form controls. He discusses how to align form labels and inputs nicely, how to add focus styles to show which input is active, and how to create custom radio buttons and checkboxes with images. One thing I really appreciated was his discussion of cursor styles. You can change what cursor appears when you hover over different elements: a pointer for links, a text cursor for inputs, a move cursor for draggable elements. These small details improve usability by giving users visual feedback about what actions they can take. The layout chapters are where everything comes together. Duckett explains the different positioning schemes in CSS: normal flow, relative positioning, absolute positioning, and fixed positioning. Each has different use cases and behaviors. Normal flow is a default. Block level elements stack vertically. Inline elements flow horizontally within lines. Relative positioning moves an element relative to where it would normally be. Absolute positioning removes an element from normal flow and positions it relative to its nearest position ancestor. Fixed positioning is like absolute positioning, but relative to the viewport. The element stays in place even when you scroll. Understanding these positioning schemes was a breakthrough moment for me. So many layout problems that had confused me suddenly made sense. Duckett uses clear diagrams and examples to show how each positioning scheme works and when you'd use each one. He also covers the float property, which was originally designed for wrapping text around images, but became the primary tool for creating multi-column layouts before Flexbox and Grid existed. Floating elements removes them from normal flow and pushes them to the left or right, allowing other content to flow around them. He shows how to float multiple elements next to each other to create columns, and how to use the clear property to ensure elements don't wrap where you don't want them to. Now, I should mention that in 2026, we have much better tools for layout: CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid. These weren't widely supported when this book was written, so Duckett teaches float-based layouts. While floats are somewhat outdated for layout now, understanding them is still valuable because you'll encounter them in older code bases, and they're still useful for their original purpose of wrapping text around images. Duckett covers both fixed width and liquid flexible layouts, explaining the pros and cons of each. Fixed width layouts maintain the same width regardless of screen size, which gives you more control but can leave awkward gaps on large screens or require scrolling on small screens. Liquid layouts expand and contract to fill the available space, which is more flexible but can lead to uncomfortably long line lengths on large screens or cramped content on small screens. He introduces the 960-pixel grid system, a popular framework at the time for creating structured, proportional layouts. While we've moved beyond the specific system, the underlying principles, using a grid for consistency, thinking in columns, maintaining visual rhythm, remain fundamental to good design. The Images chapter is all about using CSS to control image size, alignment, and background images. Duckett explains that you can set image dimensions in CSS rather than in HTML, which gives you more flexibility. You can create classes for different image sizes and apply them as needed. For alignment, he shows how to use float to position images to the left or right with text wrapping around them, or how to center images using the display, block and margin, auto techniques. These are fundamental skills that you will use constantly. The background image section is particularly rich. Duckett covers how to add background images to any element, how to control whether they repeat or not, how to position them, how to make them fixed or scroll with the content, and how to use the background shorthand property to set multiple properties at once. He also discusses image sprites in more detail, showing how to create rollover effects and more complex image-based interfaces. And he covers CSS3 gradients, which let you create smooth color transitions without images. While the syntax for gradients has evolved since this book was written, the concept and basic approach are still relevant. One really practical section covers creating image galleries and using CSS to create consistent, attractive presentations of multiple images. This is a kind of real-world application that makes the theoretical knowledge concrete. The HTML5 layout chapter is where Duckett introduces the new semantic elements that HTML5 brought to the table. Before HTML5, developers used div elements with class or ID attributes to structure pages. Div class equals header. Div class equals an AV. Div class equals article. HTML5 introduced specific elements for these common patterns: header, NAV, article, section, aside, footer. These semantic elements make your code more meaningful and self-documenting. When you use an article element, it's clear that this is a self-contained piece of content. When you use a NAV element, it's clear this is navigation. This benefits accessibility, as screen readers can use these landmarks to help users navigate. It benefits SEO, as search engines can better understand the structure of your content. And it benefits maintainability, as other developers can more easily understand your code. Duckett explains each new element, what it's for, when to use it, and how it fits into the overall structure of a page. He covers header and footer, which can be used for the page as a whole or for individual sections, NAV for navigation, article for standalone content, section for grouping related content, aside for tangential content, and figure and fig caption for images with captions. One important point he makes is that these new elements don't automatically look different. They're semantic, not presentational. You still need CSS to style them, but they provide a better foundation for your HTML structure. He also covers a challenge of supporting older browsers that don't recognize these new elements. Internet Explorer 8 and earlier, in particular, had issues with HTML5 elements. Duckett shows how to use the HTML5 shiv, a small JavaScript file, to make older IE versions recognize and style these elements. In 2026, this is much less a concern since IE is dead and modern browsers all support HTML5, but it's interesting from a historical perspective. The process and design chapter shifts gears from technical implementation to planning and thinking about design. Duckett walks through the process of creating a website from scratch, starting with understanding your audience and their needs. He emphasizes asking questions about who your target audience is, their demographics, their goals, their motivations. He introduces a concept of creating personas, fictional representations of your typical users. This might seem like extra work, but it actually saves time by giving you a clear picture of who you're designing for. When you're making design decisions, you can ask yourself, would Gordon or Molly want this? Instead of just guessing. Next, he covers determining what information visitors need and how to organize it. This involves creating site maps, hierarchical diagrams showing all the pages on your site and how they relate to each other. He discusses card sorting techniques, where you write each piece of content on a card and group related items together to figure out your site structure. Then comes wireframing, creating simple sketches of what will go on each page without worrying about visual design details. Wireframes focus on layout and information hierarchy. Where will the logo go? How prominent should the navigation be? What's the most important thing on this page? Duckett shows examples of wireframes and explains how they help you and your clients focus on functionality before getting caught up in colors and fonts. The sections on visual hierarchy and design principles were some of my favorites in the entire book. Duckett explains how to guide users' attention through size, color, and style. Larger, bolder, or brighter elements draw the eye first. He discusses grouping and similarity, how proximity, color, and borders can show relationships between elements. He covers the principles of consistency, creating visual rhythm through repetition. He also talks about navigation design, making concise, clear, selective, contextualized, interactive, and consistent. These principles apply whether you're designing a simple blog or a complex web application. Good navigation doesn't just help users find things. It helps them understand what your site offers and how it's organized. What I really appreciate about this chapter was how Duckett connects design theory to practical implementation. He's not just teaching you how to code. He's teaching you how to think like a designer. And that's crucial because writing HTML and CSS is ultimately about communicating information and creating user experiences. The final chapter covers practical aspects of launching and maintaining a website, search engine optimization, analytics, and hosting. For SEO, Duckett explains the basics, using keywords and page titles, headings, and link text, writing descriptive alt text or images, creating URLs that make sense, using meta descriptions. He emphasizes that SEO is about making your content accessible and understandable, both to search engines and to human users. The analytics section introduces Google Analytics and explains how to interpret the data it provides. How many people visit your site, where they come from, what pages they look at, how long they stay. This information is invaluable for understanding whether your site is meeting users' needs and where you might need to make improvements. The hosting section covers domain names, web hosting providers, FTP for uploading files, and choosing between shared hosting, VPS, or dedicated servers. While some specific recommendations might be outdated, this is from 2011 after all, the general concepts remain relevant. You still need a domain name, you still need a hosting provider, and you still need to understand the basics of how to upload your files and manage your site. Duckett also mentions third-party tools and services that can extend your site's functionality, blogging platforms, e-commerce solutions, email newsletter services, social sharing buttons. The specific services he mentions might have changed, but the principle remains true. You don't have to build everything from scratch. There are excellent tools available for common functionality, and it's often smarter to use them than to reinvent the wheel. Okay, so after working through this entire 490-page book, what did I actually learn? What changed for me? Let me break down the key insights that really stuck with me. First, and most importantly, I finally understood the difference between structure and presentation. I know that sounds basic, but it's fundamental. HTML is about marking up content, saying this is a heading, this is a paragraph, this is a list. CSS is about styling that content, saying headings should be blue and 32 pixels tall. Keeping these concerns separate makes your code cleaner, more maintainable, and more flexible. You can completely redesign your site just by changing the CSS without touching the HTML. Second, semantic markup matters way more than I realized. I used to think HTML was just about making things show up on screen, but it's really about meaning. When you use a NAV element instead of a div or a strong element instead of AB tag, you're not just controlling appearance. You're communicating meaning. This helps with accessibility, with SEO, with code maintainability, with future-proofing your work. It's about building websites that work for everyone, and that will stand the test of time. Third, the box model is absolutely fundamental to CSS layout, and understand it was like unlocking a secret. Once I grasped that every element is a box with content, padding, border, and margin, and how those pieces interact, layout problems that seemed mysterious suddenly made sense. I stopped fighting with CSS and started working with it. Fourth, I learned to think about responsive design and different screen sizes from the beginning. Even though this book doesn't cover modern responsive techniques like media queries and Flexbox, Duckett's emphasis on flexible layouts and thinking about different contexts made me more thoughtful about how my designs would work across devices. Fifth, I gained a much deeper appreciation for typography and color theory. I used to just pick fonts and colors that looked nice, but Duckett taught me to think about contrast, readability, hierarchy, and intentional design choices. Why does this heading need to be bigger? What's the relationship between these elements? How can I guide the user's eye through page? 6. I learned the importance of planning before coding. Site maps, wireframes, understanding your audience. These aren't just busy work. They save you time and result in better outcomes. I used to start coding and figure out as I went, but that led to meandering, unfocused designs. Planning first, then implementing, produces much better results. 7th, I learned that web development is as much about problem solving and logical thinking as it is about memorizing syntax. Yes, you need to know how HTML and CSS work, but more importantly, you need to be able to break down problems, think through solutions, and understand the underlying principles. The specific syntax might change, but the problem-solving skills transfer across languages and frameworks. Finally, I learned that learning web development from a book can actually be incredibly effective. I know we live in the age of video tutorials and interactive coding platforms, but there's something valuable about the linear, comprehensive approach of a well-written book. Duckett's careful explanations, visual examples, and structured progression built my understanding in a way that jumping around between random tutorials never did. All right, let's talk about what makes this book special, because there's a reason it's been recommended for over a decade. First and foremost, the visual design of this book is absolutely exceptional. This doesn't look like a typical programming book with dense text and occasional screenshots. Every page is carefully laid out with color-coded examples, clear diagrams, generous white space, and a consistent visual hierarchy. The HTML code is shown in blue, CSS in pink. Results are clearly displayed. You can quickly scan a page and understand what's being taught. This visual approach made the book much less intimidating and much easier to work through. Second, Duckett's teaching style is incredibly clear and methodical. He doesn't assume you know anything, but he also doesn't talk down to you. Every concept is introduced clearly, explained thoroughly, demonstrated with examples, and then built upon. He anticipates common questions and confusion points and addresses them directly. The progression from basic concepts to more advanced techniques feel natural and logical. Third, the book is comprehensive. You're not getting just HTML or just CSS. You're getting both thoroughly covered, along with how they work together. From the absolute basics to fairly advanced techniques, it's all here. And crucially, he covers not just the how, but the why. Why would you use this element instead of that one? Why does this CSS property behave this way? Understanding the reasoning behind the rules makes you a much better developer. Fourth, the examples are practical and realistic. Duckett doesn't just show you trivial hello world examples. He shows you real-world applications, building navigation menus, creating forms, designing layouts, styling tables, making image galleries. These are things you actually need to do when building websites, and seeing concrete examples of how to do them is incredibly valuable. Fifth, the reference sections are excellent. Each chapter ends with a summary of the key points, and there are reference pages throughout that you can come back to when you need to remember a specific property or element. The index is comprehensive. This makes the book valuable not just for learning, but also as a reference you keep on your desk. 6. The book is remarkably up to date considering when it was published. Yes, it's from 2011, but Duckett included HTML5 and CSS3, which were still quite new at the time. He clearly put effort into making sure the book will remain relevant even as web standards evolved. And indeed, most of the content is still applicable today. 7th, the book emphasizes best practices throughout. Duckett isn't just teaching you how to make things work. He's teaching you how to do things right. Semantic markup, separation concerns, accessibility, SEO, code organization, commenting your code. These professional practices are woven throughout the book rather than tacked on at the end. Finally, the book is remarkably self-contained. You don't need any other resources to work through it. Everything you need to start building websites is here. That's powerful for beginners who might be overwhelmed by the vast amount of information available online. Now, let's talk about the limitations and weaknesses, because no book is perfect, and this one has some significant issues if you're learning in 2026. The most obvious problem is that the book is dated. It was published in 2011, which in web development terms is ancient. Some of the content is simply obsolete now. The entire chapter on Flash? Completely useless because Flash is dead. The video and audio sections cover techniques that have been superseded by better HTML5 implementations. Some of the browser compatibility workarounds he discusses are no longer necessary because we're not supporting Internet Explorer 6 anymore. The CSS layout sections teach float-based layouts, which were standard when the book was written, but have been largely replaced by Flexbox and CSS Grid. If you're learning web development in 2026, you should absolutely learn Flexbox and Grid first, and maybe learn floats just for historical context and to understand older code bases. But this book will teach you floats first because that's what was current in 2011. Similarly, there's no coverage of responsive design techniques like media queries, which are absolutely fundamental to modern web development. The book talks about liquid versus fixed layouts, but it doesn't cover the modern mobile-first responsive approach that's now considered best practice. You're going to need to supplement this book with current information about responsive design. The JavaScript coverage is minimal. While this is primarily an HTML and CSS book, modern web development almost always involves at least some JavaScript, and this book barely touches it. There's a section on using JavaScript to help older browsers understand HTML5, but that's about it. You'll definitely need additional resources to learn JavaScript. The book doesn't cover any modern development tools and workflows. There's no discussion of version control systems like Git, preprocessors like Sass, build tools, package managers, or any of the ecosystem that has grown up around web development. Again, this makes sense for when it was written, but it means the book gives you only part of the picture of what modern web development looks like. Some of the SEO advice is outdated. The meta keyword section, for example, teaches a practice that search engines no longer pay attention to. Some of the techniques he suggests for improving search rankings wouldn't be as effective today as they might have been in 2011. SEO evolves quickly, and a 13-year-old book can't keep up. The book also doesn't cover web performance optimization in depth. There's basic coverage of image optimization and file size, but modern web performance is a much richer topic involving things like lazy loading, code splitting, CDNs, caching strategies, and more. These are crucial for real-world web development, but aren't covered here. There's minimal coverage of web accessibility beyond the basics. While Duckett does emphasize semantic markup and alt text, modern accessibility is a much more comprehensive topic involving ARIA attributes, keyboard navigation, color contrast ratios, and more. If you're building professional websites, you need to go much deeper into accessibility than this book does. Finally, the book is entirely focused on static HTML and CSS. There's no coverage of server-side rendering, single-page applications, or any of the frameworks and libraries that dominate modern web development: React, Vue, Angular, Node.js, etc. Again, this is by design. It's a book about HTML and CSS fundamentals. But you should be aware that professional web development involves much more than what's covered here. So, after spending 2 weeks with this book, working through the examples, and thinking deeply about its place in the current landscape, here's my verdict. Jon Duckett's HTML and CSS. Design and build websites is still a valuable resource for beginners in 2026, but with significant caveats. Let's start with who I'd recommend this book to. If you're a complete beginner who has never written a line of HTML or CSS, and you learn well from structured, comprehensive books rather than scattered online tutorials, this book is excellent. The visual design makes it approachable, the explanations are clear, and the progressive structure builds your knowledge effectively. You'll come away with a solid foundation in HTML and CSS fundamentals. If you're a visual learner who finds typical programming books too dense and intimidating, this book is perfect. The layout, diagrams, and color coding make complex concepts digestible. You can skim a page and understand what's being taught before diving into the details. If you're a designer who wants to understand how to implement your designs in code, this book bridges that gap beautifully. Duckett thinks like a designer and explains technical concepts in terms that make sense from a design perspective. If you're teaching web development to others, especially younger students or those without technical backgrounds, this book is an excellent textbook. The clear explanations and visual approach work well in a classroom setting. However, there are some significant caveats. You cannot rely on this book alone to learn modern web development. You'll need to supplement it with current resources on Flexbox and CSS Grid for layout, responsive design and media queries, modern JavaScript, at least the basics, current SEO best practices, web accessibility standards, development tools, and workflows. If you're in a hurry to learn web development for a job or project, this might not be the most efficient path. The book is comprehensive, which means it takes time to work through, and then you'll still need to learn the modern techniques that aren't covered. If you're the type who learns better from video tutorials or interactive coding exercises, you might find a book-based approach doesn't work well for you, no matter how well-designed the book is. If you already have some web development experience and are looking to level up, this book probably isn't for you. It's fundamentals focused and doesn't go deep enough into advanced topics to be valuable for intermediate or advanced developers. Here's what I'd recommend as the ideal approach. Use this book to build your foundational understanding of HTML and CSS. Work through the examples, build the projects, really engage with the material, but supplement it immediately with current resources on responsive design, Flexbox, Grid, and modern best practices. Think of this book as providing the foundation, but recognize that you need to build on top of that foundation with contemporary knowledge. My overall rating for this book in 2026? I'd give it a solid 7 out of 10. It loses points for being dated and for what it doesn't cover, but it gains points for the exceptional clarity of its explanations, the beautiful visual design, and the solid fundamentals it teaches. Those fundamentals, understanding semantic markup, the box model, how CSS selectors work, the principles of web typography and color, those haven't changed and probably won't change. That makes this book still valuable even 15 years after publication. Would I recommend it over more current resources? That depends. If you learn well from books and want a comprehensive, structured approach to learning HTML and CSS fundamentals, then yes, this is still one of the best books available. But pair it with modern tutorials on responsive design and current layout techniques. If you're more comfortable with video tutorials or prefer to learn by building projects, you might be better served by resources like Free Code Camp, Scrimba, or Kevin Powell's YouTube channel that cover the same fundamentals but with current techniques. You know, going into this review, I was skeptical. A 15-year-old web development book? In an industry that moves as fast as this one, it seemed like it would be hopelessly outdated. And in some ways, it is. The flash chapter is useless. The layout techniques are superseded. The lack of responsive design coverage is a significant gap. But what surprised me was how much of the book remains relevant. The fundamentals of HTML and CSS haven't changed that much. The principles of good design, semantic markup, separation concerns, thinking about your users, these are timeless. And Duckett's ability to explain complex concepts clearly, his visual approach to teaching, his emphasis on best practices, these make the book valuable even now. I came away from this book with a much stronger foundation in web development than I had before. Not because it taught me every modern technique. It didn't. But because it helped me understand the underlying principles that make those techniques work. I can learn Flexbox more easily now because I understand the box model. I can write better CSS because I understand specificity and the cascade. I can create more accessible websites because I understand the importance of semantic markup. If you're considering picking up this book in 2026, my advice is this. Go for it if you're a beginner who wants a solid foundation and learns well from books. But don't stop there. Use this as your starting point. Then move on to modern resources that cover responsive design, current layout techniques, and the broader ecosystem of web development tools and practices. The web development landscape has changed dramatically since 2011, and it will continue to change. But the fundamentals that Duckett teaches in this book, Those are worth learning, worth understanding deeply, and worth building on. This book won't make you job ready for a modern web development role on its own, but it will give you the foundation you need to build that job-ready skill set. And honestly, in a world of scattered online tutorials and incomplete courses, there's something refreshing about a comprehensive book that takes you from absolute beginner to having built actual websites. Is it perfect? No. Is it complete for 2026? Definitely not. But is it still valuable? Absolutely. So that's my honest review of HTML and CSS. Design and Build Websites by Jon Duckett. If you've read this book, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you find it as helpful as I did? What resources did you use to supplement it? And if you're considering getting into web development, I hope this review has helped you decide whether this book is right for you. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive. If you found this helpful, consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you're on your own web development journey, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. What resources are you using? What challenges are you facing? Let's learn together. Until next time, happy coding.